The sun over Belstead was not a source of life, but a judgment. It beat down on the cracked earth until the land itself seemed to surrender, breaking into 1,000 fissures that looked like a map of some forgotten, thirsty hell. Eli Mercer felt the heat through the worn leather of his saddle and the thick wool of his shirt. It was a dry, punishing heat that baked the breath in a man's lung and turned sweat to salt before it could offer any relief. For 3 days he had ridden through this wasteland, a featureless expanse of gray sagebrush and skeletal mesquite, with only the relentless wind for company. It was a mean wind, one that never settled, carrying a fine, gritty dust that worked its way into his eyes, his teeth, and the deepest corners of his soul. His horse, a sturdy buckskin named Gideon, lowered its head, its sides heaving with exhaustion. The town ahead was not a welcome sight. It was a collection of splintered, unpainted buildings huddled together as if for protection against the vast emptiness that surrounded them. A sign, its letters faded by the sun and scoured by the dust, creaked on a single hinge. "Welcome to Belstead." The word welcome was a lie. Nothing about this place felt welcoming. It felt like an end. Fences lay in broken heaps, their wires curled and rusted like dead snakes. Tumbleweeds, the ghosts of last season's life, piled up against the walls of the livery stable. It was a town holding its breath, waiting for the final blow. Eli had been following whispers, rumors that grew louder and uglier the closer he got. They started as tales of cattle rustlers, common enough in this part of the territory. But the stories had changed. They spoke of men who dealt in a different kind of stock, a trade that left a colder sickness in the gut. They spoke of people vanishing, of debts paid not in coin, but in flesh. Eli had seen his share of wickedness, enough to know that the worst stories were almost always the truest. He was not the law, not anymore. He was just a man who carried a weight, and sometimes the only way to lighten his own burden was to take on someone else's. He swung down from Gideon, his joints protesting the long ride. The town's main street was little more than a wide dirt track, pocked with the tracks of wagons and horses, but empty of life now in the oppressive afternoon heat. The only sign of activity came from a 2-story building that slumped in the center of the street, a saloon on the bottom floor, an inn of sorts on the top. The sign above the batwing doors was freshly painted, a stark contrast to the rest of the town's decay. It read simply, "The Last Chance." Eli led Gideon to the livery, the scent of dry manure and old hay a familiar comfort. He paid the stable hand, a boy with eyes too old for his face, and made sure his horse had water and feed before he took his saddlebags and rifle and walked back toward the saloon. Pushing through the doors was like stepping into a different kind of heat, one thick with the smell of stale whiskey, unwashed bodies, and something else, something sour and desperate. The place was dim, the light from the dusty windows struggling to cut through the haze of tobacco smoke. A handful of men were scattered at tables or slumped over the long wooden bar. They were hard-looking men, their face etched with the lines of cheap liquor and cruel choices. They looked up as Eli entered, their eyes lingering on the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip, and then dismissed him, turning back to their drinks. At the far end of the room, 2 women in drab, ill-fitting dresses moved between the tables. They did not walk so much as drift, their smiles as thin and brittle as glass. When one of them laughed at a man's crude joke, the sound was hollow, a perfect echo of the emptiness in her eyes. Eli had seen women like that before. They were not people here. They were part of the scenery, like the spittoons and the tarnished mirror behind the bar. Possessions. A large man with a gut that strained the buttons of his vest stood polishing a glass behind the bar. His face was fleshy, his eyes small and shrewd. He was the owner. A man did not get a belly like that in a town like this without taking more than his fair share. "Need a room," Eli said, his voice raspy from the dust. He dropped a few coins on the bar. The owner grunted, sweeping the coins into his palm without looking at them. "Room's upstairs, second on the right. Keys in the door. No women unless you pay for them downstairs first." He smirked, revealing a row of yellowed teeth. Eli ignored the comment, his gaze sweeping the room again. And a bottle. The owner slammed a bottle of whiskey and a dirty glass on the bar. Eli took them and turned toward the staircase at the back of the room. The stairs groaned under his weight, each step a complaint. The hallway above was narrow and dark, smelling of dust and loneliness. His room was just as the man had described, a small, airless box with a sagging cot, a rickety table, and a single window that looked out onto a trash-filled alley. It was a place for a man to drink himself into oblivion or wait for a bullet. He set the bottle and his rifle on the table, but did not drink. He stood at the window, watching the sun bleed across the horizon, painting the barren plains in shades of orange and purple. A beautiful death to a miserable day. The sounds from the saloon below grew louder as the evening wore on, the murmur of conversation giving way to rough laughter and the occasional angry shout. It was the sound of men trying to forget who they were, or perhaps to celebrate it. Restless, Eli left the room and went back downstairs. He needed to get the lay of the place, to listen. He took a seat at a small table in a dark corner, nursing his glass of whiskey, letting the noise of the saloon wash over him. He was good at being invisible, at watching men reveal themselves when they thought no one of importance was looking. An hour passed. The whiskey was raw, burning a trail down his throat. It did little to dull the ache in his bones or the disquiet in his mind. He was about to go back up to his room when he saw a door behind the bar, slightly ajar. It was a small, low door, leading, he presumed, to a cellar or storage room. The owner lumbered over to it, pulling a heavy ring of keys from his pocket. He unlocked a large padlock, opened the door just enough to squeeze his bulk through, and disappeared inside, leaving the door unlatched. Eli's curiosity was a curse. It had gotten him into more trouble than he could count, but it was also the only thing that kept him moving, the only thing that gave the long, empty days a purpose. He watched the bar, waiting for a moment when no one was looking, when a fight nearly broke out between two gamblers at the far end of the room, drawing everyone's attention. He stood and moved silently toward the back. He pushed the cellar door open another inch, his eyes adjusting to the gloom beyond. The air that rose up to meet him was cold and damp, thick with the smell of earth and mildew and something else, the smell of human misery. A single lantern cast a weak, flickering light over the space below. It was a root cellar, its dirt walls lined with shelves of preserves and sacks of potatoes. But that was not what held his gaze. In the far corner of the cellar, half hidden in the shadows, was a figure. At first, it was just a shape, a pale form against the dark earth. Then his eyes focused, and the breath caught in his throat. It was a woman. She was sitting on the hard-packed dirt floor, her back against the wall. A heavy iron chain was clamped around her left ankle, the other end bolted to a thick metal ring embedded in the wall. Her feet were bare and caked with dirt. The hem of her dress, a simple cotton garment that might have once been white, was torn and filthy. She had her knees drawn up to her chest, her arms wrapped around them, her head bowed so that her face was hidden by a cascade of dark, tangled hair. He could see her wrists. They were raw and bruised. The skin rubbed away where ropes must have bound her before the chain. The sight struck Eli with the force of a physical blow. It was not just the cruelty of it, the sheer, casual barbarity. It was the stillness, the utter and complete despair in her posture. She was not fighting. She was not crying out. She was simply there, a broken thing thrown in a corner. A cold rage, sharp and clean, cut through the weariness in his soul. He felt the familiar pull, the old and terrible grief that lived just beneath the surface of his skin. The image of the woman in the cellar blurred, replaced for a heartbeat by another memory, another woman. His wife, Sarah. He saw her lying in the ashes of their home, her dress torn, her body broken. He remembered the silence of that place, the way no one had come when she screamed. The neighbors had been too afraid. The law had been too far away. No one had come. The owner emerged from the cellar, a crate of whiskey bottles in his arms. He grunted with the effort, his face slick with sweat. He kicked the door shut behind him and was turning to relock it when he saw Eli standing there. His eyes narrowed. "What do you want?" he snarled, his voice a low growl. "This part of the establishment is private." Eli did not move. His hand was not near his gun, but his whole body was a weapon. "The woman," he said, his own voice dangerously quiet. "Who is she?" The owner, Silas, set the crate down with a thud. He straightened up, trying to use his size to intimidate. "She's nobody, just a piece of property settling a debt." He wiped a hand across his greasy mouth. "Nothing that concerns you." "She's in a chain," Eli stated, the words flat and cold. Silas chuckled, a wet, unpleasant sound. "She's got a temper, a biter. Had to teach her some manners. Tried to run, now she knows her place." He looked Eli up and down, a flicker of contempt in his eyes. "She's a whore who bit the wrong man, got what she deserved." Each word was a shovel of dirt on his wife's grave. She got what she deserved. He remembered hearing those whispers after Sarah's death, the way people tried to make sense of the senseless, to find a reason, any reason, that it had been her and not them. She was too friendly. She shouldn't have been alone. They had blamed her for her own murder, just as this man was blaming the woman in his cellar for her own chains. The rage inside Eli was a living thing, a fire that threatened to consume him. He could kill this man. It would be easy, a single, fluid motion. But that would not help the woman in the cellar. It would likely get her killed. He had to be smarter than his anger. He had to find another way. He forced his hands to unclench, his voice to remain steady. He would play the game by this town's rotten rules, at least for now. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his money pouch. It was not much, everything he had in the world, but it was enough to make a man like Silas listen. "Who do I pay to set her free?" The question hung in the air between them. Silas stared at the pouch, then at Eli's face. He seemed to be weighing the value of the coins against the pleasure he took in his cruelty. Then, a slow, ugly smile spread across his face. He threw his head back and laughed. It was not a sound of amusement. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated contempt. The sound of a man who enjoyed breaking things, who saw the world as something to be devoured. "Set her free?" he finally wheezed, wiping a tear of mirth from his eye. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, his breath foul with whiskey and rot. "Son, you are a fool." He laughed again, a short, sharp bark. "You can't buy what's already broken." He turned, slammed the padlock onto the cellar door, and twisted the key. The sound of the lock clicking shut was like a coffin being nailed closed. He picked up his crate and lumbered back to the bar, leaving Eli standing alone in the shadows, the laughter still echoing in his ears. That night, sleep was an impossibility. Eli sat on the edge of the cot in his small, dark room, his loaded Winchester rifle resting across his knees. The moon cast a pale, sickly light through the grimy window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the still air. His mind was a battlefield, torn between the burning desire for immediate, violent retribution and the cold, hard reality of his situation. To storm the cellar now would be suicide. Silas was not the only evil in this town. He was just the most visible. The men drinking in the saloon downstairs, the whole rotten structure of Belstead, was built on a foundation of this kind of cruelty. To fight it head-on would be to drown in it. He was a good man, or he tried to be, but the world had a way of grinding the good out of a man, leaving only the hard, unyielding core. Sarah's death had done that to him. It had taught him that righteousness was no shield against a bullet, that prayer was no match for a fist. All that mattered was what a man was willing to do when he was pushed to the edge. And he was standing on that edge now, looking down into the abyss. Then he heard it. It started as a faint sound, so quiet he thought at first it was the wind whistling through the cracks in the walls. He held his breath, listening. It came again. A low, shuddering sound from below. It was the sound of weeping, muffled by the thick wooden floorboards and the noise of the saloon, but unmistakable. It was not a loud, theatrical sorrow, but a deep, hopeless grief. The sound a soul makes when it believes it has been utterly abandoned by God and man. The sound traveled up through the floor and into his bones. It settled in the hollow place that Sarah's memory had carved inside him. He closed his eyes, his knuckles white on the stock of his rifle. He had been too late for his wife. He had not heard her cries until they were silenced forever. But he could hear these. The rage did not subside, but something else settled over it. A cold, unshakable calm. He would not act tonight. He would not let his anger be the undoing of them both. He would wait. He would watch. And he would find a way. The crying continued, a soft, rhythmic punctuation to the long, dark night. And with every muffled sob, Eli Mercer's resolve hardened into something as solid and as deadly as the steel of the gun he held in his hands. He would not be leaving Belstead. Not until she was free. Dawn in Belstead did not break. It seeped. A thin gray light crept over the horizon, doing little to chase away the chill of the desert night. Eli Mercer was already awake. He had not slept, merely rested his eyes. The woman's muffled sobs, a constant, ghostly presence in the quiet moments. He moved with a stiff, deliberate purpose, splashing cold water on his face from a chipped basin. The face that stared back from the murky water was that of a stranger he knew too well, a man with eyes that had seen too much and a jaw set against a world he no longer understood. His first stop was the sheriff's office. It was a small, sad building wedged between the general store and an abandoned assay office. The paint was peeling, and the sign bearing the word sheriff hung crookedly, as if in shame. Eli pushed the door open without knocking. The room inside was just as neglected. Dust lay thick on a potbelly stove, and stacks of yellowed papers listed precariously on the edge of a desk. Behind the desk sat a man who seemed to be made of the same dust. He was in his late 50s, with a soft, doughy face and a network of broken blood vessels across his nose and cheeks. A tin star was pinned to his stained vest, but it held no authority. It was an ornament, a prop in a play he had long forgotten his lines for. The sheriff, a man named Brody, looked up from a cup of what smelled like yesterday's coffee. He flinched slightly when he saw Eli, a flicker of fear in his watery eyes. He had seen Eli in the saloon the night before, had noted the way he carried himself, the way he watched everything without seeming to watch at all. He knew this was not a man looking for a cheap drink. This was a man looking for trouble. "Something I can help you with, stranger?" Brody asked, his voice attempting a gruffness it could not achieve. Eli walked to the desk and placed his hands flat on its surface, leaning forward just enough to make the sheriff feel crowded. "I have a question about the law in this town." Brody swallowed, his gaze darting around the room as if looking for an escape. "The law is the law, same as anywhere." "Is it?" Eli's voice was low, without emotion. "Does the law in Belstead permit a man to keep a woman in chains in his cellar?" The sheriff's face went pale. He pushed his chair back, the legs scraping against the floorboards. "Now, hold on. What Silas does on his own property is his business. It ain't for me to interfere. She's a human being, Sheriff, not a stray dog." "She's a debtor," Brody said, grabbing onto the word like a lifeline. "She owes him. It's a civil matter." Eli straightened up, his eyes cold and hard as river stones. "I saw the bruises on her wrists. I saw the chain. That's not a civil matter. That's a crime." The sheriff's pretense of authority finally crumbled. He slumped in his chair, a man defeated not by a threat, but by the simple, ugly truth. "Look," he said, his voice dropping to a pathetic whine. "You don't understand this town. Silas. He keeps things orderly. He has friends, important friends, men with money. You come in here, a stranger, stirring things up. You don't know what you're messing with. So you look the other way, Eli said. It was not a question. Brody would not meet his eyes. He stared at a crack in the floor, his shoulders slumped. He pays me to look the other way. Not just me. He keeps this town from blowing away. The gold he brings in, the business, it's the only thing holding Belstead together. You take that away. And what's left? Nothing but dust. He finally looked up, his eyes pleading. It's just one woman. What am I supposed to do? Burn the whole town down for one fallen woman? Eli stared at him for a long moment, the silence stretching until it became an accusation. He saw in Brody the same weakness he had seen in the faces of his wife's neighbors, the fear that masqueraded as practicality, the cowardice that called itself peace. He had come here looking for the law, but there was no law in Belstead. There was only a vacuum, filled by the will of the cruelest man. You've already let it burn, Eli said softly, and turned and walked out, leaving the sheriff alone with his gold and his silence. Getting back into the cellar was a transaction that left Eli feeling filthy. He went to Silas in the late afternoon. When the saloon was quiet, he slapped a silver dollar on the bar. I want to see the woman, he said, his voice flat. Silas's eyes lit up with a greedy, knowing light. He mistook Eli's interest for the common, sordid appetite of his other customers. Getting curious, are you? Thought you were a righteous man. He chuckled. They all are, until they're not. He pocketed the coin. 15 minutes. And if you touch her, it'll cost you more. Eli followed him to the back, his jaw tight. Silas unlocked the heavy padlock, the sound echoing in the quiet saloon. Don't get any ideas, he warned, his hand resting on the butt of a pistol tucked into his waistband. The cellar was as he remembered, cold, damp, and smelling of despair. The woman was in the same corner, her posture unchanged. She did not look up when the door opened, did not react when Eli stepped down into the gloom. He waited until Silas had closed and locked the door from the outside, plunging them into near darkness, save for the thin slivers of light that crept through the cracks in the floorboards above. He stood there for a full minute, letting his eyes adjust, letting her feel his presence without imposing it. He could hear her breathing, a shallow, unsteady rhythm. My name is Eli Mercer, he said, his voice soft. She did not respond. Her face was still hidden by her hair, a dark curtain that separated her from the world. I want to help you. A sound came from her then, a small, bitter puff of air that might have been a laugh if she had any laughter left in her. Help me! Her voice was a dry rasp, unused and brittle. Men don't help women like me, they use them. I'm not other men. Yes, you are, she whispered, the words sharp with a pain that went far beyond the chain on her ankle. You're all the same. You paid him, didn't you? You paid him to be down here with me. You're just another customer. She still would not look at him. Her refusal was a shield. To meet his eyes would be to acknowledge him as a person, and to her, he was just another shadow in a long line of them. He took a careful step closer. He could see the faint outline of her cheekbone, the hollow of her temple. What is your name? He asked gently. Why? So you can whisper it while you take what you paid for. She finally lifted her head, and the slivers of light caught the fury in her eyes. They were dark, deep-set, and filled with a fire that had not yet been completely extinguished. It was the first sign of life he had seen in her. Get out, she hissed. Do what you came for or get out. He saw then the depth of her prison. It was not just the cellar, not just the chain. It was the belief that she was no longer worthy of a name, of a simple human kindness. To her, his gentle tone was just a more insidious kind of trap. He took a step back, respecting the boundaries she had drawn. I'm not going to touch you, he said. I just want to talk. I have nothing to say to you. She lowered her head again, the curtain of her hair falling back into place. The conversation was over. The time he had paid for ticked by in a heavy silence. broken only by the sound of their breathing and the distant clink of glasses from the saloon above. When Silas came to unlock the door, Eli left without another word. But as he stepped out of the cellar, he heard her whisper a single word, so quiet he almost missed it. "Annabeth." He began to piece her story together from the scraps and whispers he collected around the town. Belstead was a place that fed on secrets, and people were willing to talk if they thought no one of importance was listening. He learned from the young barmaid, a girl named Clara with haunted eyes, that Annabeth had been brought in months ago by a man who called himself a traveling preacher. He had sold her to Silas to settle a supposed gambling debt and had been gone by morning. He learned from the blacksmith, a stooped old man who spoke more to his anvil than to people, that Annabeth had once been a schoolteacher in a town called Harmony, a full week's ride to the east. "Heard she got in trouble," the blacksmith mumbled, not looking up from the horseshoe he was shaping. "With a politician's son. They said she led him astray." The full, ugly picture came into focus one evening when Eli shared a bottle with a down-on-his-luck prospector passing through town. The man was from Harmony and remembered the scandal well. Annabeth Kane had been the town's beloved schoolteacher, known for her kindness and her love of poetry. But she had made the mistake of rejecting the advances of the son of a powerful landowner. To protect his son's pride and reputation, the father had concocted a story. He accused Annabeth of seducing the boy, of being a woman of loose morals. In a town that valued reputation above all else, the accusation was a death sentence. There was no trial. The whispers were enough. She was fired from the school. Her friends turned their backs on her. Her own parents, devout and fearful of the scandal, had disowned her, telling her she was no longer their daughter. Cast out and alone, she had left town with nothing but the clothes on her back. That was when she had met the preacher on the road, a man who offered salvation and delivered her into hell. The townspeople of Belstead had their own version of the story, a version that made them feel better about the woman chained in the cellar. They had absorbed the lies and embroidered them with their own cruel judgments. "She's a fallen woman," a woman at the general store said to her friend, her voice a pious whisper loud enough for Eli to hear. "She made her bed. Now she has to lie in it." "They say she was always prideful," the other replied. "Thought she was better than everyone else. Pride comes before the fall." They spoke of her as if she had chosen the chain, as if the cellar was a destination she had sought out. It was easier that way. If it was her fault, then it could not happen to them. It made the world feel safe. It allowed them to sleep at night while a woman wept in the darkness beneath their feet. Their judgment was a second wall around Annabeth's prison, one made of whispers and self-righteousness. Eli began to watch the town with new eyes. He was no longer just looking for a way to free Annabeth. He was mapping the web of corruption that held her captive. He saw how Silas held court at the bar, how men who should have known better deferred to him. He saw Sheriff Brody making his rounds, avoiding the saloon, his eyes always on the ground. He saw the way money moved, the way fear kept mouths shut. He realized that other women had likely passed through that cellar, that Annabeth was not the first, and if he did nothing, she would not be the last. Silas was not just a cruel saloon owner. He was a trafficker, and this town was his own private marketplace. He kept going back to the cellar. He paid Silas's silver dollar each day, a price that felt like a penance. He never stayed the full 15 minutes. He would just bring her something. A piece of bread he had bought from the baker, an apple, bruised but fresh. One day, he brought a cup of clean water, and she drank it so thirstily it nearly broke his heart. She fought him every step of the way, not with the fire she had shown him at first, but with a weary, heartbreaking resistance. "Why are you doing this?" she asked one afternoon, her voice hollow. "Because it's not right," he answered simply. "Nothing in this world is right," she shot back. "Your bread won't change that. It just makes the rat I eat tomorrow taste worse." He learned not to argue, not to make promises he could not yet keep. He would just sit in the silence, a few feet away from her, until his time was up. He was showing her, day by day, that he was different. He did not want her body. He did not demand her gratitude. He just kept showing up. The change in her was slow, almost imperceptible. She started to lift her head when he came in. She stopped flinching when he spoke. The wall between them was still there, but it was no longer a fortress. It was a ruin, and he could see the person hiding behind it. One day, he found her shivering, the damp cold of the cellar having seeped into her bones. The next day, he brought her a thick wool blanket. He unfolded it and laid it down just within her reach. She stared at it, then at him, her eyes filled with a terrible confusion. "Stop," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Please, just stop." "You're cold," he said. "Don't you understand?" she cried, tears finally breaking through her tightly controlled composure. "You're making it harder. It was easier when I hated everyone. It was easier when I believed I deserved this." "You don't deserve this," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "No one does." "You don't know what I did." "It doesn't matter what you did." She hugged her knees to her chest, rocking back and forth, the sound of her own quiet sobs filling the small, dark space. He stayed until she was quiet, his heart aching with a grief that felt both new and ancient. He was a fool to think he could simply break her chain and set her free. The iron on her ankle was the least of her shackles. The true chains were the ones she had forged herself, out of shame and loneliness and the belief that she was utterly alone. He came back the next day, as always. She was wrapped in the blanket. She had been crying, he could tell, but her eyes were clear. She looked at him, truly looked at him. For the first time, she saw the lines of sorrow around his mouth, the exhaustion in his posture. She saw a man who was as broken in his own way as she was in hers. "They all left me," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "My friends, my family. The man who said he would help me. He sold me. Everyone just walked away." Eli sat on the cold ground, the space between them feeling smaller than ever before. He did not know what to say, so he said the only thing that felt true. "I'm not walking away." She looked down at the chain on her ankle, at the dirt on the floor, at the life that had been stolen from her. A single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. "You know," she said, her voice so soft he had to lean forward to hear it. "The worst part isn't being chained. It's not the cold or the hunger. It's that I stopped hoping anyone would care." The hope Annabeth had spoken of was a fragile, dangerous thing. It took root in Eli's heart and demanded action. Patience was a virtue he could no longer afford. For days, he had been observing, listening, taking the measure of the town's rotten soul. He had seen the cowardice of the law and the complicity of the townspeople. He understood now that Belstead was not a town with a problem. It was a problem that looked like a town. But Annabeth's whispered confession had changed the calculus. He could not leave her to wither in that cellar while he formulated a perfect plan. Hope, once kindled, had to be fed, or it would turn to ash. He decided on a direct approach, a fool's errand. Perhaps, but one his conscience demanded he undertake. He waited until midday, when the saloon was nearly empty, and confronted Silas at the bar. He did not bother with pleasantries. He took out the worn leather pouch that held every dollar he had to his name, the sum of 2 seasons' hard work, enough to buy a small piece of land. A fresh start. He upended it on the bar, a collection of gold eagles, silver dollars, and smaller coins rolled across the stained wood. A small fortune in a place like this. "This is everything I have," Eli said, his voice level. "Sell her to me." Silas looked down at the money, his thick lips curling into a smile. He did not look surprised, only amused. He methodically began to stack the coins, his fleshy fingers moving with a practiced greed. He counted it all, his eyes gleaming. For a moment, Eli felt a flicker of the dangerous hope he was trying to buy for Annabeth. When Silas finished counting, he pushed the stacks of coins back toward Eli. "It's a good start," he said, his voice oozing a false cordiality. "But the price has gone up." Eli's hand instinctively moved toward his hip. He stopped it. "We didn't agree on a price." "We didn't," Silas agreed pleasantly. "But you see, my property has become more valuable. You've shown me that. You've been visiting her, bringing her things. You've put a shine on her. An investment like that, well, it raises the market value." He leaned his heavy forearms on the bar, his face inches from Eli's. The smell of stale whiskey and sweat was suffocating. "The price is double what you have here, and I'll want it in gold." Eli felt the cold rage coiling in his gut. This was not a negotiation, it was a game, and Silas was enjoying every moment of it. The saloon owner was not just a businessman. He was a sadist who fed on the desperation of others. He did not just want to profit from Annabeth's misery. He wanted to prolong it. "She's not a piece of property," Eli said through gritted teeth. Silas's smile vanished. His eyes turned hard and flat as a snake's. "She is whatever I say she is. And you are a guest in my town, in my establishment." He gestured with his head toward the batwing doors. "You can take your money and ride out of here, and I'll forget we ever had this conversation. Or you can stay. You can keep asking questions. You can keep stirring the mud at the bottom of my pond." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. "But I promise you this. You keep stirring, and you'll be the one who drowns in it. Am I clear?" The threat was as plain as the pistol tucked in Silas's belt. Eli slowly, deliberately, swept the coins back into his pouch. He had lost. He had tried to play by the town's rules, and the rules had been changed to ensure he could never win. He met Silas's gaze, a silent promise passing between them that this was not over. He turned and walked out of the saloon, the owner's soft, triumphant chuckle following him into the dusty street. Frustration and a profound, aching heartsickness settled over him. He was trapped. He could not buy her freedom. He could not take it by force without getting them both killed. He felt a helplessness that reminded him too much of the days after Sarah's death, a feeling of being a ghost in his own life, powerless to change the one thing that mattered. He walked aimlessly through the town, his boots kicking up clouds of dust, his mind a storm of fury and despair. He found himself outside the general store. In the window, among the sacks of flour and tins of coffee, was a display of writing materials, a small, leather-bound journal, a bottle of ink, a simple wood-cased pencil. An idea began to form, born not of a plan to free her body, but of a desperate need to free her mind. Silas could chain her ankle, but he could not chain her thoughts. They had taken her name, her reputation, her freedom. He could not let them take her soul as well. He went inside and bought the small journal and the pencil. It was a foolish, impractical purchase, but it felt more important than a weapon. He then went to the town's single, sad eatery and bought a loaf of fresh bread and a piece of cooked chicken, wrapping them carefully in a clean cloth. He was done paying Silas for the privilege of showing another human being a small kindness. He would find his own way in. That night, he waited until long after midnight, when the last drunk had stumbled out of the saloon and the only sound was the lonely sigh of the wind. The building was quiet. He slipped out of his room and down the back stairs, his boots silent on the worn wood. The cellar had an exterior hatch, a slanted door set against the foundation, used for loading supplies. He had noted it days ago. It was thick, heavy, and barred from the inside. But the wood around the hinges was old and soft with rot. Working carefully with his knife, in the thin light of a slivered moon, he began to pry the rusted hinges away from the frame. It was slow, painstaking work. Every creak of the wood, every scrape of the metal, sounded like a gunshot in the still night. After what felt like an eternity, the hinges gave way. He lifted the heavy door just enough to slide through, lowering it gently back into place behind him. The cellar was darker and colder than it was during the day. The air was heavy, still. He could hear Annabeth's soft breathing from the corner. He lit a small match, shielding the flame with his hand. In the brief, flickering light, he saw her. She was awake, her eyes wide with fear, pressed back against the wall. She thought he was Silas, or someone worse. "It's me," he whispered, his voice a low rumble. "It's Eli." The fear in her eyes was replaced by a profound confusion. He let the match burn out, plunging them back into darkness. He did not want to frighten her further. He sat on the ground, a safe distance away, and placed the bundle on the dirt floor between them. "I brought you something to eat," he said into the darkness. "And something else." He could feel her hesitation, her distrust. It was a palpable thing in the small space. After a long silence, he heard a faint rustling as she reached out. Her fingers found the cloth, the bread, the journal. He heard her thumb run over the smooth leather of the cover, then the sharp intake of her breath. It was a sound of discovery, of remembering a world she thought she had lost forever. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion he could not name. "It's for you," he said, so you can remember who you are." He did not stay long. He could not risk being discovered. He left her there in the darkness with the food and the journal and the pencil, and slipped back out the way he had come. Annabeth did not touch the journal for 2 days. It sat on the dirt floor beside her, a silent accusation. To write would be to feel would be to hope, and to hope was to invite a pain greater than any she had yet known. But the smooth leather of its cover was a constant temptation. She would run her fingers over it, the texture a reminder of a life of books and learning, a life that felt like a dream. On the third night, she could resist no longer. By the faint moonlight that filtered through the cracks in the cellar door, she opened the first page. She held the pencil, the feel of it unfamiliar and yet deeply comforting in her hand. Her fingers were stiff, her knuckles swollen, but she began to write. At first, it was just a torrent of rage and grief. She filled the pages with the names of those who had wronged her, the politician's son, his powerful father, the friends who had abandoned her, the parents who had cast her out, the preacher who had sold her, and Silas, the architect of her current hell. She wrote until her hand cramped and the pencil point was worn to a nub. It was a purge, a lancing of a wound that had been festering for months. Then, her writing changed. She began to write about her past, not the scandal, but the life before it. She wrote about her small schoolhouse, the faces of her students, the smell of chalk dust and old books. She wrote about her mother's garden, the feel of the sun on her face as she read poetry under an old oak tree. She wrote to reclaim her own story, to remind herself that her life was not defined by its terrible ending, but by the quiet, beautiful moments that had come before. And then, hesitantly, she began to write about the cowboy. She did not know what to make of him. He was a mystery, a quiet, sorrowful man who looked at her not with lust or pity, but with a strange, unnerving recognition. She wrote about the kindness in his eyes, a kindness that frightened her more than Silas's cruelty. She wrote about the clean blanket, the fresh bread, the impossible, miraculous gift of the journal. She filled the pages with questions she was too afraid to ask, and with the faint, terrifying sparks of something she had thought was dead forever. Eli continued his nightly visits, always bringing food, always leaving before the sun rose. He never asked about the journal. He never pushed her to talk. He just provided the quiet, constant presence that was, in itself, a kind of healing, but their secret could not last. One evening, as he sat in his corner of the saloon, nursing a whiskey, the young barmaid, Clara, approached his table. She moved with a nervous energy, her eyes darting toward the bar where Silas was holding court. "You need to be careful," she whispered, her voice so low he could barely hear her over the noise of the room. She wiped his table with a damp rag, her movements jerky. "What do you mean? Eli asked, keeping his own voice down. Him, she said, with a slight nod toward Silas. He's watching you. They all are. Her hands were trembling. You're not the first man to feel sorry for a girl in this town. She leaned closer, her fear a cold wave washing over him. There was another man, last year, a trapper passing through. He tried to help a girl. Silas had a girl like her. He tried to get her out of town. Clara swallowed hard, her eyes wide and dark. They found him a week later, hanging from the water tower. The sheriff said he took his own life, but everyone knows. Everyone knows. She straightened up, her face pale, and hurried away before he could respond. The warning hung in the air, cold and sharp as a hangman's noose. Eli looked at the men in the room, at their hard, empty faces, and he understood. This was not just Silas's operation. The whole town was an accomplice. Their silence was the rope. That night in the cellar, the air felt heavier, the danger more immediate. Annabeth seemed to sense it too. She was quiet, withdrawn. Eli gave her the food he had brought and sat in his usual spot. The silence stretched, filled with the unspoken fear that Clara's warning had planted in his mind. "Read to me," he said suddenly, the words surprising him as much as they did her. She looked up, startled. "What?" "The journal," he said, nodding toward it. "If you want to read something." He did not know why he had asked. Perhaps he needed to hear her voice, the one that was hers and hers alone, not the whispers of the town or the threats of Silas. He needed to be reminded of what he was fighting for. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the small book. It was the most intimate part of her, the last refuge of her soul. To share it was to make herself completely vulnerable. She looked at him, at his steady, patient gaze, and she saw not a threat, but an anchor in a storm. She opened the journal. Her voice, when she began to read, was a shaky whisper, fragile as a bird's wing, but it held a strength that defied the damp, cold cellar. She did not read about her anger or her pain. She read a poem she had written just the night before, about a single, stubborn flower she had once seen growing from a crack in a stone wall. She read of its struggle against the wind and the sun, its desperate, defiant reach for the light. Her voice grew stronger as she read, the words painting a picture of a small, resilient beauty in a world of desolate gray. When she finished, the silence that followed was different. It was not empty. It was filled with the fragile, beautiful thing she had created. She had taken the ugliness of her life and made a piece of art from it. Eli was profoundly moved. He saw the flower, and he saw her, and he understood that they were one and the same. He reached out, his movements slow, and gently touched her cheek. His calloused fingers were rough against her skin, but his touch was unbelievably tender. It was not a touch of ownership or desire, but of reverence. She flinched, but did not pull away. A single tear escaped from her eye and traced a path down her face. She expected him to kiss her then. It was what men did. They took, but he did not. He just looked at her, his eyes reflecting a sorrow and a compassion so deep it made her ache. He let his hand fall away. "You're not broken," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Just buried." He left her then, slipping out into the night, leaving her with the echo of his words. She brought a hand to her cheek where he had touched her, the warmth of it a stark contrast to the cold that had been her constant companion. He was right. She was buried, but for the first time in a very long time, she felt a glimmer of light, a desperate, defiant reach for the sun. Their bond had deepened into something for which neither of them had a name, an unspoken intimacy forged in darkness and shared pain. But even as it grew, they could both feel the shadows circling, the danger gathering like storm clouds on the horizon, and they both knew that the world would not long suffer such a fragile, beautiful thing to live. Eli's conversation with Annabeth had told him where she was buried. His encounter with Silas had shown him how deep the grave was, and Clara's warning had revealed that the ground was filled with the bones of others who had tried to dig. He knew now that this was not a simple matter of a cruel man and a single victim. A rot like this needed roots, and they had to run deep into the town's foundation. He began to dig. He started watching the saloon not as a customer, but as a hunter. He spent his days in the shadows of alleys, on the roof of the abandoned assay office, his eyes tracking the comings and goings. He was looking for patterns, for the connections that held the web of this place together. He saw Sheriff Brody visit Silas every morning, not with the stride of a lawman, but with the shuffling gait of an errand boy, leaving with a heavy coin purse. That was simple graft. But the real revelation came with the arrival of the circuit judge. Judge Cromwell was a man who wore his authority like a fine suit, a stark contrast to the dusty, unkempt men of Belstead. He was silver-haired, well-fed, and his pronouncements from the bench were said to be as final as God's. He held court twice a month in the town hall, and his presence was meant to signify that civilization had not entirely forgotten this forsaken corner of the territory. Eli watched as, on the evening of the judge's arrival, he did not retire to the inn's best room. Instead, he walked to the back door of the Last Chance saloon and was admitted by Silas himself. Eli crept closer, finding a spot beneath a grimy window at the back of the saloon, where the noise from the main room would cover the sound of his presence, inside a small, smoke-filled office. The three pillars of Belstead society were gathered: Silas, Sheriff Brody, and Judge Cromwell. Their voices were low, but the warped glass of the window pane carried their words to him in distorted fragments. "The ledger is in order," the judge was saying, his voice smooth and educated. "The debts are all properly recorded, foreclosures signed and sealed." "Got another one coming in next week," Silas grunted. "A farm girl from down south. Her father's got a gambling problem he don't know about yet. A few doctored IOUs, and she'll be his—" "And the paperwork will be ironclad," the judge assured him. "Should anyone from the Territorial Marshal's office ever care to look, they will find nothing but a series of unfortunate but entirely legal property seizures and debt settlements." Brody, ever the nervous one, chimed in. "What about this stranger, the one asking about Annabeth? He's been sniffing around." "A drifter," Silas said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "He tried to buy her. Has a soft spot. He'll get bored or scared and move on." "See that he does," Cromwell said, his voice losing its polished edge and taking on a cold hardness. "This enterprise is too profitable to be threatened by one man's sentimentality. These women, these assets, they are the lifeblood of this town, and we are the heart that pumps it." The pieces clicked into place in Eli's mind, forming a picture of such calculated evil it made him sick. It was a network, a conspiracy of the town's most powerful men. They were not just profiting from women who fell into their grasp. They were actively creating the traps. They manufactured fake debts, used the color of law provided by the judge to foreclose on families, and then took the daughters as payment. Annabeth was not a random victim of circumstance. She was a product, manufactured and sold by a system designed to create her. He knew then that he could not fight this from within. He was one man against the law, the money, and the guns of an entire town. He needed help. The next county, Westwood, was 100 miles away, but it had a reputation for a marshal who could not be bought. Eli's only hope was to get a message to him. The next morning, he went to Belstead's small telegraph office. The operator was a thin, nervous man with ink stains on his fingers and fear in his eyes. He recognized Eli and seemed to shrink as he approached. "I need to send a wire," Eli said, sliding a piece of paper and a coin across the counter. The message was brief and coded, speaking of a cattle disease that required the immediate attention of the Westwood Marshal, a prearranged signal he had used in his past life. The operator's hands trembled as he picked up the paper. He read it, and his face went white. I can't send this," Yes, you can, Eli said, his voice quiet but unyielding. And you will. He stood there, a silent, immovable presence, while the operator's fingers tapped out the message, the staccato clicks sounding like a final prayer. When it was done, the operator slumped in his chair, looking at Eli as if he were a dead man. He'll know, the man whispered. Silas will know. He was right. That night, a fire started in the telegraph office. It was a fast, hot blaze that consumed the small wooden structure in less than an hour. The townspeople gathered to watch, their faces illuminated by the orange flames. Eli stood at the edge of the crowd and saw the look that passed between Silas and Sheriff Brody. It was a look of satisfaction, of a problem solved. He did not know if his message had been received before the lines were cut. He could only hope, but he knew for certain that his time for subtlety was over. He had declared war. The answer came 2 nights later. He was walking back from the livery stable, the air cool and the stars brilliant in the vast, dark sky. The street was empty, the town asleep. But as he passed the narrow alley beside the blacksmith's shop, he felt it, a shift in the shadows, the whisper of movement. His instincts, honed by years of living in dangerous places, screamed a warning. He drew his Colt just as 2 figures lunged from the darkness. A gunshot exploded, the muzzle flash a blinding yellow flower in the night. The bullet tore through the muscle of his left shoulder, a searing, white-hot pain that spun him around. He hit the ground hard, the impact jarring the breath from his lungs. He rolled, ignoring the fire in his shoulder, and came up on one knee. Another shot splintered the wooden trough beside his head. He saw them then, 2 hired men from the saloon, their faces grim in the moonlight. He fired twice. The shots were deafening in the narrow alley. One man grunted and collapsed, a dark stain spreading on his chest. The other hesitated for a fraction of a second, his eyes wide with surprise. It was all the time Eli needed. His 3rd shot was true. The second man fell backward and did not move again. Silence descended, thick and heavy, smelling of gunpowder and blood. Eli pushed himself to his feet, his left arm hanging uselessly at his side. Blood was soaking through his shirt, a warm, wet tide. He could hear shouting in the distance, doors opening. He had to get off the street. He could not go to his room at the inn. There was only one place to go, one place he knew he could be safe, at least for a little while. He stumbled through the back alleys, his mind fighting against the waves of pain and dizziness. He made it to the cellar hatch, his hands fumbling with the loosened hinges. He half fell, half slid into the cold, dark space, pulling the door closed above him. "Annabeth," he rasped, his voice a dry whisper. He heard a sharp gasp from the corner, then a rustle of movement. "Eli, what is it? What's happened?" He could not answer. The last of his strength gave out, and he collapsed onto the dirt floor, the world dissolving into a gray, swirling fog. When he came to, her face was above his. The cellar was lit by a single, guttering candle she must have had hidden away. Her eyes were wide with a terror that was not for herself, but for him. "You're shot," she said, her voice shaking. "Oh, God, you're shot!" The pain in his shoulder was a dull, throbbing beast. He tried to sit up, but she gently pushed him back down. "Don't move," she commanded, a newfound authority in her voice. He saw then the struggle she was in. Her chain was taut, pulled to its absolute limit, allowing her to reach him, but just barely. She was perched on the very edge of her small world, her body straining against the iron shackle. She had torn a long strip from the hem of her already tattered dress. Her hands were gentle as she carefully cut away the blood-soaked fabric of his shirt with his own knife. He watched her face in the flickering candlelight. The fear was still there, but it was overlaid with a fierce, protective determination. She was no longer the broken woman he had first met. She was a healer, a survivor. "The bullet went through," she said, her voice a mixture of relief and grimness. "That's good, but it's bleeding badly. We have to stop it." She worked with a focused intensity, her movements hampered by the chain. She had to constantly adjust, to twist her body at awkward angles to tend to him. Every movement was a fresh reminder of her captivity. He felt a fresh surge of rage, not at his attackers, but at the iron ring in the wall that kept her from him, that made this simple act of care a painful, difficult struggle. She cleaned the wound as best she could with a piece of cloth and the last of the clean water he had brought her. She pressed the makeshift bandage against the wound, her small hands firm and steady. He gritted his teeth against the pain, his body slick with a cold sweat. They were so close, their faces only inches apart. He could feel her breath on his cheek, see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes. The world outside, with its gunshots and its fires and its cruel, laughing men, ceased to exist. There was only this small, dark space, this circle of candlelight, and the raw, desperate tenderness of her touch. When the bandage was secure, she did not move away. Her hands remained on his chest, his shoulder. The air grew thick, charged with an emotion that went beyond gratitude or care. It was the desperate pull of two lonely souls who had found a flicker of warmth in an endless, freezing night. He lifted his good hand and touched her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing for a moment. He could feel a tremor run through her. He shifted, wanting to pull her closer, to offer a comfort that was more than just words. But she pulled back slightly, her eyes opening. They were filled with a deep, aching sadness. "I want to be touched by someone who sees me," she whispered, her voice so quiet it was almost a thought. "Not someone who owns me." The words struck him with more force than the bullet had. He understood. In that moment, he saw the chasm of pain and abuse she had endured. He saw that for her, a physical act, even one born of affection, was tangled with the trauma of being treated as property. To go further now would be to take, just as all the others had taken. He let his hand slide from her face to the back of her head, and he gently pulled her forward until his lips rested on her forehead. It was not a kiss of passion, but of promise, a benediction, a vow. "Then I'll earn you," he whispered against her skin. "Not buy you." He released her, and she sat back, the chain pulling her away. The moment was broken, but something new and unbreakable had been forged between them. The news of the gunfight spread through Belstead like a plague. Eli Mercer was no longer a quiet stranger. He was a killer, a man who had shot down two of Silas's men in the street. The whispers in the town changed. Before, they had been whispers of judgment against Annabeth. Now, they were whispers of fear. Eli was trouble. He was dangerous. He did not play by their rules. Men gave him a wide berth in the street. The saloon fell silent when he limped in for a bottle of whiskey, his arm in a sling. He had become a specter haunting their guilty consciences. And then, a strange and wonderful thing began to happen. The change in the town's fear created a small crack in its wall of silent complicity. A few quiet souls, emboldened by Eli's defiance or shamed by their own inaction, began to perform small, anonymous acts of rebellion. One night, when Eli slipped into the cellar, he found a small, fresh loaf of bread waiting just inside the hatch, left by a person he would never know. A few days later, a small tin of antiseptic ointment appeared, and one morning, lying in the dirt just at the edge of Annabeth's reach, was a pair of sturdy leather shoes. They were small gifts, offerings left at the altar of a shared, secret hope. They were a sign that he and Annabeth were no longer entirely alone in their fight. A few faint glimmers of light had appeared in the suffocating darkness of Belstead. But Eli knew that light attracted monsters, and that the deepest darkness often came just before the dawn. The small, anonymous gifts were kindling, and Silas provided the spark. One morning, during his cursory check of the cellar, his eyes fell upon the pair of sturdy leather shoes tucked beside Annabeth. They were not hers. They were not his. They were an intrusion, a symbol of a world outside his control, reaching into the darkness he commanded. His face, usually a mask of smug cruelty, contorted into a mask of pure fury. To him, the shoes were not a gift of charity. They were an act of rebellion, a message that his property was being tampered with, that his authority was being questioned. That was the last time Eli saw her in the upper cellar. When he crept to the hatch that night, he found it barred from the outside with a new, heavy iron bolt. He listened for a long time, his ear pressed against the cold wood, but heard nothing. No soft breathing, no rustle of a blanket. Only a deep, tomb-like silence, a cold dread, colder than any desert night, settled in his stomach. He spent the next day watching the saloon, a grim statue of anxiety. He saw Silas supervise the delivery of a new, heavier door to a different part of the building, a section that led to a deeper, older cellar, a place used for storing ice in the winter and forgotten things in the summer. A dungeon. He learned the truth from Clara. She found him in the alley behind the inn, her face ashen, her hands twisting the fabric of her apron. "He moved her," she whispered, her words tumbling out in a rush of fear. "To the old ice house below. There are no windows, no light. He took her blanket and the journal. He says he's going to break her. For good this time." She looked at him, her eyes pleading. "There's a man coming from Arizona at the end of the week, a miner with a reputation for being hard on his women. Silas is selling her to him. He's starving her until then. He says a hungry dog is an obedient dog." The casual, calculated cruelty of it stole the air from Eli's lungs. Silas was not just punishing her. He was erasing her, stripping away the small comforts, the glimmers of humanity Eli had fought so hard to give her. He was turning her back into a thing, ready for a market. Eli's hope for a lawful resolution, for a message reaching the marshal in Westwood, died in that alley. Time had run out. If he was going to act, it had to be now. He could not storm the saloon alone. Silas had too many paid guns, and the element of surprise was gone. He needed help. Not an army, but a few good people who were tired of living in the shadow of a monster. He went first to the blacksmith, the old man who had spoken of Annabeth's past. He found him at his forge, the rhythmic clang of his hammer on steel, a lonely, defiant sound in the quiet afternoon. Eli stood and watched, not speaking, until the blacksmith laid his hammer down and plunged the glowing metal into a barrel of water. Steam hissed, and in the sudden quiet, the old man turned. "He moved her," Eli said. It was not a question. The blacksmith nodded, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a calloused hand. "Hurt as much?" "I'm going to get her out," Eli said. "Tonight, I can't do it alone." The old man stared at him, his face a roadmap of long, hard years. "You're asking me to sign my own death warrant. Son, I'm an old man. I just want to be left to my forge." "And you think he'll let you be?" Eli countered, his voice low and intense. "You think a man like that ever stops? Today it's her. Tomorrow it's your granddaughter if she looks at the wrong man. Or your forge, if he decides he wants it. You don't make peace with a wolf. You kill it, or it kills you." The blacksmith picked up his hammer, the weight of it familiar in his hand. He looked from the hammer to Eli, and his shoulders, which had been stooped with age, seemed to straighten. "What do you need?" he asked. The silent rebellion began not with a bang, but with a quiet closing of doors. The blacksmith told Eli he would be waiting in his shop, his hammer and a heavy iron pry bar at the ready. Eli then went to the general store. He did not ask the owner for help. He simply stood before him and said, "Tonight, you don't see anything, you don't hear anything, and you don't sell a single bullet to Silas or his men, no matter how much they offer." The store owner, a man whose face was etched with the weary guilt of his own complicity, simply nodded. The final piece was the law. Eli walked into the sheriff's office in the broad daylight. Brody was there, as always, trying to lose himself in his paperwork. Eli did not threaten him. He did not raise his voice. He stood before the desk, a silent specter of reckoning. "There are 2 dead men in the alley because you wouldn't do your job," Eli said, his voice flat. "There will be more tonight. Their blood is on your hands as much as mine." He turned to leave. "What do you want from me?" Brody cried out, his voice cracking with desperation. Eli paused at the door. "I want you to choose. You can be the man who wears the star, or you can be Silas's dog, but you can't be both." He walked out into the street. A moment later, the blacksmith emerged from his shop across the way, holding a pry bar. The general store owner came to his doorway and stood, his arms crossed. They did not speak. They did not move. They just stood. 3 men forming a silent, unmovable line, watching the sheriff's office. Inside, Sheriff Brody looked out the window at them, at the quiet, unyielding judgment of his town, and for the first time in years, he was forced to make a choice. The rebellion was no longer a secret. The keys came at dusk. Clara found him as he was checking the cinch on Gideon's saddle, preparing for the ride that would mean either freedom or death. She pressed a heavy, cold ring of iron keys into his hand. Her own hand was trembling violently. "These open everything," she whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "The back door, the storerooms, and the ice house. I took them from his office when he was drunk." She looked up at him, her young face a mask of desperate hope. "Don't you die. Eli Mercer, don't you dare die." She turned and fled back into the shadows before he could thank her. He waited until the moon was high. The town was quieter than usual, a nervous, expectant hush hanging in the air. He met the blacksmith at the back of the saloon. The new door to the deep cellar was thick oak, reinforced with iron straps. One of Clara's keys turned the lock, but a heavy bar was dropped across the inside. "Stand back," the blacksmith grunted. He wedged the pry bar into the crack near the frame. With a great, heaving groan of effort, he put his weight against it. The old wood splintered. The iron bar on the other side bent, then snapped with a crack that sounded like a breaking bone. The door swung inward into absolute blackness. Eli lit a lantern. The air that rose to meet them was frigid, smelling of damp earth and decay. A steep, stone staircase led down into the gloom. He handed the lantern to the blacksmith. "Stay here. Watch my back." He drew his Colt and descended into the cold. The space below was small, a stone-lined pit, and in the far corner, she was there. She was huddled in a ball, shivering uncontrollably, her dress little more than rags. She was thinner, her face gaunt in the lantern light that spilled down the stairs. But when she looked up, her eyes were not broken. They were burning, a defiant, unquenchable fire. "Took you long enough," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. He found the shackle's lock. It was old and rusted. It took 3 of Clara's keys and all of his strength to finally get it to turn. With a final, grating click, the iron cuff sprang open. For the first time in months, Annabeth was free. He helped her to her feet. She was weak, her legs unsteady. She leaned on him, her small frame trembling. But she walked. When they emerged from the cellar into the cool night air, she looked up at the moon, at the vast, star-filled sky, and took a deep, shuddering breath. It was the first free breath she had taken since she had left Harmony. Their escape was a desperate, frantic flight. They had Gideon and a second horse Eli had bought and kept hidden. They rode out of the back of the town, avoiding the main street. But Silas was not a fool. The broken door would have been discovered quickly. As they cleared the last of Belstead's sad, slumping buildings, they heard the shouts behind them. Then the thunder of hooves. A posse of Silas's men, at least a half-dozen of them, were coming after them. They fled into the desert, a vast, unforgiving landscape that offered no cover. The moon was a merciless spotlight, painting them as stark, moving silhouettes against the pale sand. The chase was relentless. The land was a sea of thorns and heat. the air filled with the dust of their pursuers. They rode until the horses were lathered in sweat, until Annabeth was slumped against the saddle horn, barely able to hold on. Just as the first gray light of dawn threatened to expose them completely, Eli saw it, a dark shape against a low rise of hills, the skeletal remains of an abandoned homestead, a collapsed roof, a single stone chimney reaching for the sky like a crooked finger. It was not much, but it was their only chance. They pushed their tired horses into a small, rocky canyon that hid the homestead from the main trail, and dismounted. They were exhausted, dehydrated, their bodies aching. The homestead was a ruin, the ghost of a family's failed dream. But the 4 crumbling walls offered shelter. They collapsed onto the dirt floor inside, listening as the sound of their pursuers' horses faded into the distance. They had lost them, for now. The sun rose, turning the desert into an anvil. The heat was oppressive. They had a single canteen of water between them. Death, Eli knew, was still a very real possibility. They might die of thirst, or the posse might circle back and find them. They were living on borrowed time. He tended to her as best he could, giving her the last of the water. Her lips were cracked. Her face was pale beneath the dust and grime. But her eyes never lost their fire. They sat in the shade of the one remaining wall, their shoulders touching, and watched the heat shimmer over the barren land. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice rough. "I got you out of that cellar just to lead you to this." She turned to look at him. She reached out and touched the bandage on his shoulder. "You got me out of that cellar," she said simply. There was no blame in her voice, only a deep, quiet gratitude. As the day wore on, a strange peace settled over them. With the likelihood of death so near, all pretenses, all fears, all the baggage of their past lives seemed to fall away. There was only this moment, this shared breath in the vast, silent desert. He looked at her, truly looked at her, not as a victim to be rescued, but as the woman she was. He saw the strength that had refused to break, the intelligence that shone in her eyes, the spirit that had survived the absolute worst of men, and he felt something deeper than pity, deeper than responsibility. It was a profound, aching tenderness, a feeling of coming home after a lifetime of wandering. He leaned in and kissed her. It was a gentle, questioning kiss, and she answered it with a quiet intensity that took his breath away. It was a kiss that spoke of shared sorrow and a desperate, shared hope. They pulled apart, their foreheads resting against each other. The silence was filled with everything they could not say. They made love there, on the hard-packed earth of a forgotten dream. As the sun began to set, painting the desert in hues of orange and blood, it was not an act of passion, but of connection. It was a prayer whispered from one body to another in the face of annihilation. His touch was not one of taking, but of giving. He was undoing the damage, the shame, the feeling of being an object, with a reverence that was its own form of healing. For her, it was an act of reclamation, of taking back the body that had been a source of so much pain and making it a source of profound, gentle pleasure. Afterward, she lay in his arms, her head on his chest, and he felt the small, shuddering sobs that shook her body. He thought at first it was pain or fear. "What is it?" he whispered, his hand stroking her tangled hair. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with tears, but her mouth was curved in a small, wondrous smile. "No one has ever just wanted me," she said, her voice breaking. "Not for what they could take from me, not for what they could do to me. They just wanted to use a body. You saw me." It was a cry not of pain, but of release, of being seen and valued for the first time since her life had been shattered. He held her close, the fierce, protective love he felt for her a burning thing in his chest. He did not know if they would live to see another sunset. He did not have a future to offer her, no pretty words of a life they would build together. He only had this one, perfect, stolen moment. "If we die tomorrow," he said softly, his lips against her hair, "at least you are free for one night." The fragile peace of the desert dawn was broken by the sound of approaching horses. Eli came awake instantly, his hand moving to the Colt holstered at his hip. He and Annabeth had huddled together for warmth through the cold night, a truce with the elements before the inevitable war with men. Now, the war was coming. He scrambled to the broken window of the homestead, peering out toward the trail. Annabeth was beside him in a heartbeat, her face pale, but her expression resolute. A dust cloud was rising in the distance, larger than a half-dozen riders. It was the posse. They had circled back. "This is it, then," she said, her voice a quiet statement of fact, devoid of panic. She was not the same woman who had shivered in a cellar. She was a woman who had tasted a night of freedom, and she would not be taken back into the darkness without a fight. "Stay here, behind the wall," Eli ordered, his own voice grim. His shoulder was a burning knot of pain, and he had only 3 bullets left. It was not a battle he could win, only one he could choose how to lose. He would spend his last 3 shots buying her a few more moments of freedom. He moved to the doorway, the crumbling stone frame offering the only solid cover, and raised his pistol. He would make them pay for every foot of ground. The riders grew closer, their forms becoming clearer in the morning light. They were not the wild, disorganized bunch from the saloon. These men rode in a tight, disciplined formation. They wore the same dusty coats and carried rifles, not just pistols. At their head was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a graying mustache and eyes that seemed to take in the entire landscape at a glance. He wore a tarnished silver star on his vest, but it was not the hollow ornament Sheriff Brody wore. This one was heavy with authority. The man raised a hand, and his riders fanned out, surrounding the homestead with a practiced, deadly efficiency. This was not a lynch mob. This was the law. "Eli Mercer," the man's voice boomed, clear and commanding. "I am Marshal Thompson of Westwood County. I received your wire. You can come out now. You are under my protection." The relief that washed over Eli was so profound it almost buckled his knees. He lowered his gun, the weight of it suddenly immense. His message had made it. The operator had done his duty before the fire. Hope, which he had thought dead and buried with the setting sun, was resurrected in the morning light. He stepped out from the doorway, his good hand raised. Annabeth was right behind him, her hand gripping his arm. The marshal dismounted, his eyes taking in Eli's wounded shoulder, Annabeth's ragged state, and the sheer desperation of their surroundings. He was a man who understood stories without needing them told. "Looks like we got here just in time," he said, his stern face softening with a hint of compassion. He looked at Annabeth. "Ma'am, are you Annabeth Kane?" She straightened her shoulders, her chin held high despite the dirt on her face and the rags she wore. "I am," she said, her voice clear and steady. The marshal nodded. "Then let's go and unmake this town." Riding back into Belstead was one of the hardest things Annabeth had ever done. She was not a captive this time, but a passenger in a wagon, surrounded by armed lawmen. Yet every familiar, ugly building seemed to mock her, to whisper of her shame. The faces of the townspeople who peered from their windows were a mixture of fear and hostile curiosity. She could feel their judgment, the same judgment that had allowed her to be chained in the first place. But then she met Eli's gaze from his horse beside the wagon. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "You are not alone," and the strength flowed back into her. The confrontation at the saloon was swift and brutal. Silas, alerted to the arrival of the marshal's posse, had barricaded himself inside with his hired guns. He had expected Eli, not the full weight of the territorial law. Marshal Thompson gave one order to surrender. It was answered with a gunshot from an upstairs window. The ensuing firefight was not a long, drawn-out battle. The marshal's men were professionals. They moved with a cold efficiency, breaking windows, laying down covering fire, storming the doors from the front and the back. Eli, his shoulder throbbing but his purpose clear, was with them, his own gun adding to the cacophony. Annabeth watched from the wagon, her heart pounding with every shot, praying for him to be safe. It was over in minutes. 2 of Silas's men were dead. The rest surrendered, throwing their guns into the street. Sheriff Brody, who had tried to hide in his office, was dragged out by 2 deputies. He was weeping, a pathetic, broken man. He unpinned his star and let it fall into the dust. Silas never surrendered. He tried to flee out the back, a bag of gold clutched in one hand and a pistol in the other. He ran right into Marshal Thompson. He fired a wild shot, and the marshal returned fire once. The single shot was precise, final. The monster of Belstead fell face first into the filth of the alley behind his saloon. His reign of terror ended not with a roar, but with a choked, pathetic gasp. The aftermath was a slow, painful reckoning. Marshal Thompson took over the town hall, turning it into a makeshift federal courtroom. Judge Cromwell, summoned from his rooms at the inn, tried to bluster and assert his authority, but the marshal simply looked at him with cold contempt. Your authority in this town, Judge, is a matter for investigation. For now, you will sit and you will listen. The trial that followed was not just of Silas's men, but of the town itself. One by one, the quiet, fearful people of Belstead were called to testify. The blacksmith, the general store owner, even Clara, her voice shaking but her words true. They spoke of the fear, the intimidation, the web of corruption that had held them all captive. And then it was Annabeth's turn. When she walked to the front of the room, a hush fell. She wore a simple dress Clara had lent her. Her hair was clean and tied back. She looked not like a victim, but like a teacher about to command a classroom. Her hands trembled as she placed them on the railing of the witness stand. Her eyes swept over the faces in the room, the men and women who had whispered about her, who had justified her chains. She saw Eli standing against the back wall, his steady gaze a lighthouse in a storm. She began to speak. Her voice, at first, was a whisper. She spoke of her life in harmony, of the lie that had destroyed it. She spoke of being cast out, of the false preacher, of the moment she was sold to Silas. And then she spoke of the cellar. She did not spare them the details, the cold, the hunger, the darkness, the iron chain, the despair. As she spoke, her voice grew stronger, filled with a righteous anger that had been buried for so long. She was not asking for their pity. She was demanding their witness. She was telling the truth, a truth they had all conspired to ignore. Tears streamed down the faces of some of the women in the room. The men stared at the floor, the weight of their shame finally too heavy to bear. When she was finished, the silence in the room was absolute. It was the sound of a town's soul being laid bare. Judge Cromwell was arrested on the spot, his fine suit and silver hair no longer a shield against the rot he had nurtured. The trafficking ring was broken, its leaders dead or in chains. Belstead was a town in ruins, but for the first time, it had a chance to rebuild on something other than lies. In the weeks that followed, a kind of cleansing occurred. The territorial governments and administrators, new families, hearing of the cheap land and the departure of the old guard, began to trickle in. Annabeth received a letter from the mayor of Harmony. Her name had been cleared. The politician's son had confessed. They offered her an apology and her old teaching position back. She held the letter in her hands, the paper a testament to a life that no longer felt like hers. To go back would be to step into the ghost of a girl who no longer existed. That girl had been innocent and trusting. This woman was a survivor. She had been forged in a cellar, and she could not go back to a world that had thrown her away so easily. She politely declined the offer. Instead, she found her purpose in a small, struggling settlement a day's ride from the ashes of Belstead. It was a town called Redemption, a place populated by the dispossessed, the widows of a mining disaster, struggling immigrant families, people who, like her, were outcasts looking for a new beginning. With the money Eli had tried to use to buy her freedom, a fund supplemented by the government's seizure of Silas's assets, she bought a small, abandoned church. She turned it into a school. Her students were not the clean, well-fed children of Harmony. They were rough, sometimes wild. Their clothes were patched, and their bellies were often not full. But their eyes were hungry for knowledge, for a chance. She taught them to read and write, to do sums. But more than that, she taught them that their beginnings did not have to be their endings. She gave them the hope that had been given back to her. She had found her own kind of redemption, not in being forgiven, but in forgiving the world enough to try and make a small piece of it better. Eli did not stay. It was not in his nature. The wanderlust, the restlessness that had driven him for years, was a part of him. He continued his life on the trail, working on ranches, sometimes taking short-term jobs as a deputy in towns that needed a steady hand and a fast gun. He was a man of the frontier, and his home was the vast, open space under the sky. But his wandering was different now. It was no longer a flight from the ghosts of his past. It was a journey with a destination. His path always, eventually, led back to the small town of Redemption, to the little schoolhouse with the sound of children's laughter spilling from its windows. He would stay for a week or a month, helping to repair the roof or chop wood for the winter. His quiet, steady presence, a comfort she came to depend on. And then he would leave again. It was their rhythm, a life built not on possession, but on a deep and abiding connection that transcended distance. One cool evening in the late autumn, nearly a year after she had walked free from Belstead, Eli rode into town. School had just let out, and the children were chasing each other across the dusty schoolyard. Annabeth stood on the porch, watching them, a gentle smile on her face. She was no longer the gaunt, haunted woman from the cellar. Her face was fuller. Her eyes were clear and bright, and she moved with a quiet, confident grace. She was not just free, she was whole. She saw him ride up, and her smile widened. He dismounted and walked toward her, the setting sun at his back. They did not need to speak. Their silences were as comfortable and full of meaning as any conversation. He stopped before her, his hat in his hands. He said nothing. He simply reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small, simple object. It was a ring, not of gold or silver, but of braided horsehair, dark and light strands woven together. A common craft of cowboys with too much time on their hands. It was a piece of him, of his life on the trail. He held it out to her in the palm of his calloused hand. It was not a question. It was a statement, an anchor. She looked from the ring to his face, at the quiet, steadfast man who had walked into the darkest corner of her world and refused to leave. Tears welled in her eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of a gratitude so profound it was almost painful. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers closing over his, and the simple, handmade ring. She smiled through her tears, her voice a soft, wondrous whisper. "You didn't just set me free," she said. "You stayed." Thank you for joining us on this journey through the American West. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from to connect with fellow fans. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts with us in English.